Hello and welcome to the World Deciphered, brought to you by the Cipher Brief. I'm your host, Iya Meurmishvili. This week saw the inching forward of a ceasefire deal between Israel and Hamas that could bring much-needed relief to the region in nearly 11 months into Israel's war in Gaza. A war that was prompted by Hamas's horrific terrorist attacks inside Israel on October 7th of last year. Today we're talking with National Security Council spokesman John Kirby about where things stand after months of negotiations aimed at a ceasefire deal, as well as the release of all the hostages that Hamas kidnapped on October 7th.
We are going to do what we have to do to defend Israel. We're going to absolutely do what we have to do to defend ourselves and our facilities.
And Ambassador Gary Grappo is joining us to talk about just what's at stake if a deal succeeds or fails.
As in any negotiation, have reached the most difficult point where really tough issues remain, where both sides seem to be dug in.
And then Clifford May, founder and president of the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, a conservative think tank based in Washington, D.C., will give us his perspective on how the war in Gaza could end.
Behind both Hamas and Hezbollah and Islamic Jihad and the Houthis is the Islamic Republic of Iran. That is the most serious problem.
First, though, the Cipher Brief produces a daily open source report on what's happening in the world that is modeled on the brief that intelligence analysts use to keep the President of the United States up to speed on what's happening in the world of national and global security. The Cipher Brief's Brad Christian joins us now for a look at what other stories were topping the brief this week. Brad?
Hiya, great to see you again. It was another very big week in the world of national security headlines with some really interesting developments that I want to share with you. As tensions continue to escalate in Eastern Europe, Ukraine faces significant challenges while also making some notable advances. Here's the latest. The situation is described as dire in eastern Ukraine, where the city of Pokrovsk, a vital stronghold for Ukraine, is on the brink of being overtaken by Russian forces. This 60,000 person city is strategically important, and its capture would be a significant setback for Ukraine. Despite a surprising offensive by Ukrainian forces in Russia's Kursk region, Kyiv has struggled to halt the Russian advance in Donetsk. The fall of Pokrovsk could open the door for Russia's advances towards the major cities of Dnipro and Zaporizhia, located roughly 200 kilometers to the west. Exhausted Ukrainian forces, facing shortages of ammunition and manpower, are battling to hold the line as residents there evacuate amid the slow, grinding, but encroaching Russian advance. However, Ukraine is not without some very notable successes this week. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky announced the capture of another Russian settlement in Kursk during a visit to Ukraine's Sumy region earlier this week. The operation is part of a broader Ukrainian strategy to halt Russian attacks on civilians and regain control of key territories. Zelensky also reported decreased cross-border artillery strikes and a reduction in civilian casualties in the Sumy region, providing a rare glimmer of hope amid the ongoing conflict. Now, in response to those Ukrainian incursions, Russia has begun installing concrete shelters in the Kursk region, particularly in crowded areas like bus stations. This move comes after intense fighting has led to mass evacuations and fears of further Ukrainian advances into Russian territory. These shelters are also being set up near critical infrastructure, which includes the Kursk nuclear power plant. Meanwhile, in Europe, a NATO airbase in Germany went on high alert after intelligence suggested a potential terrorist threat. The security level was raised to Charlie, indicating a high likelihood of an attack. The base is crucial. It houses NATO's AWACS surveillance planes, which continue operations despite the heightened threat. Now, the alert comes amid growing concerns about Russian sabotage and cyber attacks across Europe and amid NATO warnings of increased aggressive activities by Moscow. And finally, FBI Director Christopher Wray has sounded the alarm on what he describes as an unprecedented level of threats facing the United States today. In an exclusive interview with the Associated Press, Wray pointed to a wide range of dangers from domestic and international terrorism to Chinese espionage and foreign election interference. Wray emphasized the importance of partnerships with other law enforcement agencies to counter these growing threats effectively. he did describe the threats that we're facing today as historic. And that's a wrap of the stories that are leading the news cycle this week, Ia. But one quick note. Last week, the Cipher Brief had an exclusive interview with a currently serving CIA officer who's closely associated with the agency's efforts to recruit Russian spies from deep inside Russia, and they're using technology to make that happen. You can find out how they're doing it and how well it's working on thecipherbrief.com.
Thanks, Brett. Let's remind everyone that if you would like to sign up for access to the Daily Brief, you can do so by becoming a subscriber plus member at thecipherbrief.com. And now back to the Middle East. Time and again, a Gaza ceasefire deal has seemed so close. Just last week, a senior U.S. official said negotiations had reached the end game and that all sides had a deal that now was ready to close. Here's Cipher Brief's managing editor, Tom Nagorski, with a look at the long and complicated road to an agreement.
Since the Hamas terror of October 7th and the beginning of Israel's war in Gaza, there has been almost constant high-level diplomacy in search of a ceasefire and the release of hostages held by Hamas. Secretary of State Antony Blinken has traveled to the region 9 times since October in pursuit of a deal. It worked once. A deal in November led to a week-long pause in the war and the release of 70 hostages and more than 200 Palestinian prisoners. But every other effort has failed, and each time Israel and Hamas have blamed one another. The main sticking point involves the specifics of a ceasefire. Hamas wants a longer-term stop to the fighting and some guarantee that the war will end. Israel has insisted on the right to resume fighting until Hamas is no longer a threat. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu says that in any ceasefire, Israeli troops must patrol Gaza's southern border with Egypt, known as the Philadelphia Corridor, to prevent Hamas from rearming. Hamas has said Israeli troops must withdraw completely from Gaza. Israel says that when tens of thousands of displaced Palestinians begin returning to their homes, Israel must be able to screen them to be sure they're not armed. Hamas demands free movement for Palestinians as they return. Finally, differences remain on the actual Palestinian prisoners to be included in any deal and how many of them. Israel wants veto power over a list. While the negotiators struggle, more than 100 hostages are still believed held in Gaza, though it's not clear how many are alive, and more than 40,000 Palestinian civilians have been killed. Secretary Blinken now says these latest negotiations may be the last hope. If he's right, and if the talks fail, it's not clear how or when the war in Gaza will end. I'm Tom Nagorski for the World Deciphered.
The White House has been engaged in an intense few weeks of diplomacy as Secretary of State Antony Blinken and CIA Director Bill Burns have both worked for months now on a potential ceasefire deal. I spoke this week with National Security Council spokesman John Kirby about how the White House is preparing for what comes next. Mr. Kirby, thank you very much for joining us today and welcome to the World Deciphered.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm glad to be here.
Let's start with Secretary Blinken's visit to the region. He just visited the region with intense diplomatic efforts and proposed a so-called bridging proposal to the sides. How optimistic are you? Where are the talks now, and how do you anticipate them to continue?
Well, Secretary Blinken's trip was consequential and important. It was a major muscle movement here in trying to move this process forward. And what I can tell you today is that the teams are gathered in Cairo. Brett McGurk, our coordinator for the Middle East, was there last night, had some initial constructive conversations, not just with the Israelis, but with the Qataris and the Egyptians about the next steps. Our CIA director, Bill Burns, is now in Cairo, and the discussions will kick off again this afternoon. I suspect that they'll run into the weekend, but they have been constructive. Now, look, I don't want to be Pollyannish. We don't have a deal right now. What needs to be done is both sides need to hammer out the details of implementation here, how the deal's actually going to be put into effect and held into effect. And both sides have to be willing to meet their commitments in the deal that was already, the framework of the deal that was already approved. So again, starting out this weekend with constructive conversations, and we certainly hope that we can make some more progress over the course of the next couple of days.
Well, Secretary Blinken met with his counterparts, and now you're saying that Director Burns will have his meetings. Who is he meeting with, and why do we have this difference? What's the reason or purpose for having this dual track?
Well, it's more than dual track. I mean, you've got the National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, involved, and of course, the president himself. The president had a constructive conversation with Prime Minister Netanyahu just a couple of days ago. That followed a couple of conversations he had with the Emir of Qatar and the president of Egypt. And I suspect you're going to continue to see the president involved and engaged in the days ahead. It's an all hands effort, as we used to say in the Navy. It's not a dual track. This is what you got to do when you've got such a significant national security interest at stake, not just for the United States, but for our friends in Israel and for the region writ large. You want everybody on deck, everybody pulling on the lines and trying to get us there, and that's exactly what the approach that we're taking.
Okay. Now let's talk about the proposal itself. We don't know the details of the proposal, but Hamas has claimed that the terms of the proposal have changed at the last minute at Israel's request. What's different in the current proposal from the one that Hamas agreed to in May and in July?
Well, listen, I'll tell you, the proposal that the president put forward in the end of May, that the architecture of the deal, was basically agreed to by both sides. And we said at the time that the devil's going to be in the details. And by the details, we mean the implementation details, how you actually get this agreement into effect and keep it in effect. And that's where we're at right now. In the process of talks back and forth since May, of course, both sides have amended text or suggested changes. That's the way negotiations work. It stuns me a little bit that some folks are surprised here that we still need talks and that there are still questions being asked and answers being tried to find. I mean, that's how negotiations work. Both sides, go back and forth until you finally get something worked out. And of course, nothing is agreed to until everything is agreed to, and not everything is agreed to right now. So that's the way negotiations work. I don't want to be predictive here. I don't want to tell you that we're definitely going to come out of the weekend with something. We certainly hope so. That's what the energy we're putting towards it. But what really matters now is that both sides come together and agree to put this thing into effect and move it forward and agree to the basic implementation details. I'd rather not go into what those details are. I think you can understand we're at a very sensitive time, and I don't think it would be helpful to have all that stuff out in the public, but that's what we're focused on.
But I do have to ask you about some of the biggest disagreements between the sides. So Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu wants to make sure and guarantee Israel's security by controlling access points and possibly even presence of the IDF inside the strip, which Hamas says that it's a red line for them. So how do you see this major difference being resolved?
The deal says, if you go back and look at the architecture, it says that Israel will agree to remove their force presence from populated areas and go to the east. That's what it says. And Israel has agreed to that stipulation. And so now what does that exactly look like? Well, that's part of the discussions that we're having here and hope to have in Cairo. Again, I don't want to get into more detail in terms of what side is a proponent of which exact detail and fact, but the framework itself that both sides agreed to does have Israel, the IDF, withdrawing from populated centers and to the east. And that central element has been agreed to. Now it's really a matter of what does it look like? And that's what kind of some of the things they're going to be talking about.
That's what they're talking about at the moment. And you're hopeful that it may be moving forward.
Yeah, we are hopeful. Again, I don't want to sound too sanguine about this. This is difficult stuff, but it's important stuff. I mean, I think it's important to take a step just back, and realize what this deal would do. It would stop the fighting and potentially end the war, but stop the fighting at least for a period of 6 weeks, which of course brings down the violence incredibly. The death and the suffering, the injuries, the wounds that are being experienced by innocent Palestinians living in Gaza would stop. It would also give us all a chance to get more humanitarian assistance in, flooding the zone with trucks to get more food, water, medicine, fuel, the kinds of things that Palestinians are so desperately in need of. And of course, not unimportantly, it gets hostages home. Not all of them, but the most at risk, the elderly, the sick, women. And that's important too for all those families that are anxiously waiting for to be reunited with their loved ones. And there's also, of course, political prisoners on the other side, that Hamas wants back, that they would get back as well. So there's an awful lot of goodness here in this architecture, in this proposal for everybody, including, if not, as importantly, the Palestinians of Gaza.
Let me ask you about the statement that Secretary Blinken made. He said that this talks might be the last chance. What does that mean in terms of the negotiations? What does that mean in terms of the U.S. diplomacy and everything else that you just talked about?
We have been approaching this with an incredible sense of urgency. It is at the top of the list of priorities that President Biden has right now. I can say that honestly. I know that's a fact. He has been personally engaged in this, will stay personally engaged in this. We believe it's time to end this war. And we believe that we are as close as we've ever been with this deal to doing exactly that. But it comes down to the details, and it comes down to both sides being willing to make the right commitments on those details to get it into effect. So I think what Secretary Blinken was rightly talking about was the important moment that we're in, the critical moment that we're in, and the very, very high sense of urgency with which we're trying to meet that moment.
And the talks will continue. It's not referring to it as might be a last chance does not really mean that the U.S.
Well, look, we got talks going into the weekend. Let's see where we get to. But I think what Secretary Blinken was talking about was how far we've come since May, how close we are since May. And we've got to capitalize on this incredibly important moment that we're in right now.
Let me ask you about Iran now. Iran threatened retaliation after the killings of Hamas and Hezbollah leaders. We have not seen any of the retaliation, and some experts, including telling to the Cipher Brief, are saying that Iran most likely is waiting for the outcome of these negotiations. How do you see this situation, and why do you think Iran has not retaliated? It's a good thing.
I can't get in between the ears of the Supreme Leader. I wish I could, but I don't know what he's thinking on any given day. I'll tell you, we're monitoring this very, very closely. You're right, we haven't seen Iran attack Israel, but they certainly haven't said that they're not either. And we got to take the rhetoric and the preparations that we know they have made very seriously. So we too have made preparations. We've added force capability to the region, a couple of aircraft carriers, aircraft squadrons, and additional ballistic missile defense capabilities, both on the ground and at sea. We got to be ready in case Iran decides to move against Israel. We got to defend Israel, but we also have to defend our troops and our facilities in the region, and we are ready to do that. Look, we don't want it to come to that. We hope it doesn't come to that. And we've sent those messages to Iran directly through vehicles that we have available to us, and some of our counterparts have also delivered those same messages to Iran. We'll see what happens. The Iranians have said that they want to see a ceasefire as well. in Gaza. Well, my goodness, that's what we're working on. That's back to what we've been talking about for the last 10 minutes. That has been an extremely high level of focus here for the administration and for the president, and we're working on that very seriously. And as I said earlier, and as Secretary Blinken has said, we're close. We're closer than we've been before. We want to finish that work.
Now, many observers also say that what we see in the Middle East, including the Houthi attacks, which we had not too long ago, just yet another one, Hezbollah, Hamas, it's because of the policy of aggression of Iran towards Israel, which it calls a ring of fire, as you know. What is the administration doing to sort of keep Iran accountable? I understand what you're saying in your previous response, but is there any specific steps that the administration is taking?
Well, it is basically what I said before in terms of making sure we have an appropriate defensive posture in the region. And that's what it is, by the way. It's a defensive posture. We're not looking for a fight with Iran. We're not looking for a broader war in the conflict. And as a matter of fact, I'd go so far as to say that everything President Biden has done since the 7th of October has been designed not only to help Israel defend itself, and we've done that, including putting U.S. fighter aircraft in the skies to shoot down drones and missiles that were aimed at them back in April by Iran, but also diplomatically to do everything we can to kind of de-escalate the tensions. So that has been a key focus of ours. And that includes messaging to Iran diplomatically. It includes messaging to Iran tangibly in terms of the military forces that we've added to the region. Now, look, whether that changes the supreme leader's calculus, I don't know. We certainly hope that it will give him pause not to seek an escalation in the region. But we can't be perfectly predictive, which is why we're going to continue that diplomacy. It's why we're going to continue to watch and monitor what Iran is doing versus what they're saying, and to make sure that we have appropriate force capability to defend ourselves and defend Israel if it comes to that. On the broader issue of Iran, nobody can look at what this administration has done over the last 3.5 years and say that we're not holding Iran accountable for their destabilizing behaviors. More than 600 sanctions, 60 sanction packages on 600 entities and individuals to hold them accountable for everything from killing protesters to maritime shipping attacks to supporting Russia's war in Ukraine. And again, take a look at the force posture that we have in the Central Command, the Middle East region. It remains incredibly robust, one of the most robust force presence of American troops and defensive capabilities in the world. That sends a strong message, too, about not only how important we take our interest there, but about how willing we are to continue to hold Iran accountable for all their activities.
So the Iranians at this point must be getting a message from you that it will be very costly if there is any sort of escalation.
We hope that the message they're getting from us is that we are going to do what we have to do to defend Israel. We're going to absolutely do what we have to do to defend ourselves and our facilities, and that we don't want to see an escalation. We're not looking for an all-out war. We certainly aren't looking for a war with Iran, but we hope that all of those messages have the desired effect, which is no escalation, no all-out war, no regional conflict. But if Iran chooses a different path, it would be imprudent and foolish if we weren't ready to be able to defend ourselves and to defend our friends.
Mr. Kirby, thank you very much for your time. Iran also has a role to play in what's happening in Israel's war with Gaza. Promised retaliation after the assassination of a Hamas leader in Tehran has been slow to arrive, with Tehran signaling that it may be slow to deliver a promised response in an effort not to derail ceasefire negotiations. The Cipher Brief expert, Ambassador Gary Grappo, who served as America's ambassador to Oman, as well as Charge d'Affaires and Deputy Chief of Mission of the U.S. Embassy in Riyadh, spoke with us about Iran's vital role in this conflict. Ambassador Grappo, thank you very much for joining us and welcome to the World Deciphered.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
Let's start from your assessment of how do you think this latest round of talks are going on? Where do you think we are in terms of the ceasefire talks?
Well, I think we've progressed to the point where virtually all of the so-called easy to moderately difficult issues appear to have been resolved. And now we, as in any negotiation, have reached the most difficult point where really tough issues remain, where both sides seem to be dug in. And the real sticking point at the moment appears to be the question of the Israeli insistence that troops remain in the Philadelphia corridor to maintain security in Gaza and prevent the inflow of various war weapons, supplies, and equipment, etc., into Gaza. And the Hamas is obviously resisting that request for the very reason that the Israelis want to set it up, and that is they rely on the tunnels underneath that corridor to resupply them with their essential goods and weapons and components of weapons. And Hamas has taken advantage of it by exploiting the access to bring in the goods that they need, mostly through the tunnel, very complex, extensive tunnel system, but occasionally, but less frequently these days, cross-border.
Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu says that controlling access to Gaza, for those reasons that you just mentioned, is important to Israel's long-term security, whereas Hamas says that it's a red line for them. So do you think that aspect could be resolved, and what would be the mechanism? How would it be possible?
Well, fortunately, we have America's premier negotiator leading at least the American side of the talks in CIA Director Bill Burns. Of course, he has a very long and distinguished career in the State Department, where he rose to be Deputy Secretary of State. During my time, when I worked for him, he was Assistant Secretary of State for the Middle East. He has about as thorough an understanding of this issue and the broader issues of the Middle East as anyone in the U.S. government today, and probably more than 98% of most, if not all of them. He truly is a genuine asset. And so I think Bill Burns understands that he's going to have to find some way of managing this. One possibility is maybe for an initial period of time, anywhere from, say, 3 to 6 months, whatever it might be, where the Israelis might have the kind of control that they're asking for now. And then they would revisit, the parties would revisit this issue, say 90 days into the ceasefire, to see what kind of solution might be worked out in terms of maybe another force performing that function, maybe an Arab force, or maybe even some sort of multilateral force is drawn from other countries who'd be willing to perform the task. It would be somewhat of a difficult task. A lot of pressure would be on them in order to identify and then interdict anything moving through these tunnel systems.
Let me ask you about the statement that Secretary Blinken made. He said that this might be the last chance, and that's a quote, for the talks if they fail. What do you think that statement means?
Well, having been a diplomat myself, there is no last chance. Diplomats can always come back to the table and discuss and negotiate. Clearly, the negotiations have reached a critical stage, and the United States may have the impression that maybe the sides have given all they can give. It's not clear to me, but Mr. Blinken is attempting to put a little more positive spin, because at the end of the day, there are really only two individuals who matter in these negotiations, Bibi Netanyahu and Yahya Sinwar. And both of them seem to have pretty firm positions, but could be mollified, as I said earlier, with some measures.
Where do you see the negotiations in terms of who needs to compromise?
Well, compromise always involves both sides, and so and particularly on that issue, there is going to have to be compromise on both sides, which is always difficult, particularly on these really nettlesome core issues, core interests of either side. And I've indicated why this particular issue is important to both sides, and we shouldn't discount the possibility of a compromise, particularly when we have good people, like I said, Bill Burns, but also the Egyptians and the Qataris working hard to find some bridging proposal that's acceptable to both sides. By the way, it's important to keep in mind also that their respective constituencies are putting a lot of pressure on these individuals. Sinwar in Gaza and Netanyahu in Israel. I mean, what we see taking place in Israel is more public, more visible, and better known. A lot of pressure on Bibi to come to this ceasefire. And he's also facing a lot of pressure externally, particularly from the United States. Sinwar, it's clear Gazans want this war over months ago. And there's some growing evidence that Gazans are becoming harshly critical of Sinwar for dragging this out when the ultimate end is already pretty apparent. So the pressure is there. I think Sinwar has to ask himself, where does he go from here? Is he going to spend the rest of his days living in a tunnel somewhere beneath Gaza? I'm sure that's weighing on his mind. And so there are just a lot of questions that we can't answer that have not been made public. So I think it's important to keep our focus on the genuine progress and statements that are coming from each of those two individuals or their expressed representatives.
You said that those two individuals are the most important people in these negotiations. How about Iran?
Iran unquestionably plays a vitally important role, and I do wonder if there isn't some messaging taking place, say between some member of the negotiating party, i.e., probably not the United States, although it could be, but more specifically Qatar and Egypt with Iran to try and tamp down the temperature in the region, number one, and number two, to perhaps even communicate to Sinwar that now may be a good time for him to stand down for a while with the ceasefire. But unquestionably, Iran is playing a pivotal role. I think one of the reasons we have not seen Iran or Hezbollah respond to the killings of Haniya and Fuad Shukr, the Hezbollah military leader, is simply because they don't want to fan the flames in Gaza. They would like to see, even if they may not say it publicly, they want to see a ceasefire. Mm-hmm. They want to see the temperature lowered in the region. Iran, in particular, I think, is recognizing that this effort to employ their proxies to go after their enemies, Israel, the United States, perhaps others, is becoming less effective, and that conflict or the possibility of conflict is becoming or is coming closer and closer to Iran. And we have seen this now with the Israeli response to the Iranian attack in April, where the Israelis sent rockets to destroy a radar facility with a very precise strike, one that probably sent a very clear message to Iran: we can hit anywhere in your country with very powerful weapons. And I think everyone in Iran probably took note of that. And so the Iranians have to calibrate very carefully now how they respond to the Haniya killing in their capital in a highly secure facility. And so one way to diffuse that is if a ceasefire is achieved and the Iranians can arguably say, look, we have a ceasefire, we want to keep the temperature down in the region. They don't have to say they're not going to respond. They're not going to respond for now. And see how this thing rides out. But Iran plays a vital role, and I think the various proxy groups will follow suit, including Hezbollah.
While a ceasefire deal remains a critical component of what happens next in the Middle East, not everyone believes that Hamas will hold up its end of the bargain. Clifford May, the president of the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, talked to us this week about why he believes Hamas wants to continue this fight and why he thinks a deal with Hamas is not broad enough to bring the changes that the region needs. Cliff, thank you so much for joining us today and welcome to the World Deciphered.
Thanks. Good to be here.
Let's start from the latest that we know about the negotiations in the Middle East. What do we know? What's the latest?
What we know is that Hamas doesn't want to make a deal, and that Hamas is saying no to a deal that Tony Blinken thought was reasonable and had done. Hamas wants to win. Hamas is not interested in a ceasefire. Hamas does not want to give up the hostages. It finds them useful. Hamas does not even want to promise that if and when there is some deal to give up the hostages, those hostages won't be shot in the head and delivered as dead bodies. They won't even promise that. So in a way, this has been a kabuki theater, I think, for a very long time, because Yahya Sinwar, who is the Hamas leader, ruler, call it what you will, we believe still in Gaza in one of the many tunnels that they've built, bigger than the New York subway system. He wants to fight to the end, and he wants to fight for victory. Victory means that means two things for him. One, that Hamas emerges successful. He can give a victory sign and say, you see, we beat the Israelis. But what he would also like is for Hezbollah to continue, as it has since October the 8th, to continue to bomb Israel as it has been in the north. And then he would like the Islamic Republic of Iran, which directly attacked Israel on April 13th, to do so again. What he wants is a regional war supporting the war that Hezbollah began on October 7th of last year, and he wants the Islamic Republic of Iran and all its proxies, Hezbollah, Islamic Jihad, the Houthis, the Shia militias in Syria and Iraq, all to attack Israel simultaneously and once and for all wipe Israel and Israelis from the face of the earth. If people don't understand that's what's going on, then they don't understand the reality.
Some 109 hostages still remain, and we don't know how many of them are alive. What kind of impact does this hostage situation create for the Prime Minister Netanyahu? And in this peace negotiations, who benefits from it?
Well, it creates a terrible dilemma. Hostages always have. Remember that years ago there was an exchange of one Israeli hostage for about 1,000 convicted Hamas and other terrorists. Among those who were released was Yahya Sinwar, who is now the one who is the leader of Hamas, who initiated the October 7th attacks, and who we theoretically are negotiating with. So it's a big problem. Yes, the Prime Minister, whoever he is, will want as a priority to get the hostages back, whether it's Netanyahu or somebody else. But you don't want to create a situation where more hostages are taken a month later or a year later and you're in the same situation. Nor do you want to have a situation where you get a promise to release hostages and what you get back are dead bodies. Mm-hmm. There may be hostages alive, and if Hamas is not saying we'll give them back alive, there's nothing to stop them from shooting the hostages in the head and then turning them over in exchange for all kinds of concessions, such as the release of convicted terrorists, such as the Israelis pulling back and not taking on the various cells and even battalions that continue to exist on the Hamas side. So it's not an easy negotiation. Now, if you are a family who has a hostage being held there, you want everything and anything to be done, come hell or high water, pull out all the stops, get my family home. I get it, I understand that. I would say if you're the Israeli Prime Minister, you have to, sadly, you have to think about more than that. You have to think not only about the hostages who are being held, who are being tortured, have been tortured for 10 months. You have to think about who else may be killed, who else may be taken hostage as a result of negotiations if you are not competent in negotiating.
How would you describe the situation, public opinion in Israel regarding the hostage?
Well, I'm not in Israel, so I can't say exactly. I think for the most, look, the hostage families want them back, and I don't blame them, and so they protest. Please make deals and make some concessions to do so, and in a free country you can do that. In Gaza, you don't have people going out and marching and saying, please release the hostages, stop killing Israelis, and let us try to reconstruct our lives. There are Gazans who believe that. There are Gazans who say that, and they're often shot in the head or dragged through the streets for saying that. I think most Israelis do understand two things. One, that Hamas needs to be incapacitated militarily and can't be restored as the governing authority in Gaza. The other thing most Israelis understand, and I don't think this is well communicated in much of the media, is this is not just about Hamas and not just about Gaza. Again, Hamas attacked on October 7th. Hezbollah began attacking on October 8th and is attacking till this day. Behind both Hamas and Hezbollah and Islamic Jihad and the Houthis is the Islamic Republic of Iran. That is the most serious problem. And by the way, the rulers in Tehran are now in an alliance with Moscow and with Beijing, and that is an axis, I would say, of aggressors that the U.S. and others in the free world need to understand exists and is as anti-American and as anti-free world as anything we've ever seen during the Cold War.
The Ukraine war really demonstrated that connection between China, Iran, and Russia.
Iran is helping Russia against Ukraine right now. And consider what does the Islamic Republic of Iran have in common with the neo-imperialists of Moscow? Well, they both want a new world order in which they can establish their own empires or reestablish their own empires as they see it. We in the West need to understand that is the reality we face.
Cliff, I have one more question I meant to ask you earlier before we moved on to larger issues or global issues. The humanitarian situation in Gaza is something that everybody thinks about, people talk about it. Israel's being pressured because of that, including from the United States. How do you see that aspect of the war, and how do you see America's role again in that?
It could not be more simple. You want the war to stop, and you want to increase the amount of relief and assistance and even development and reconstruction assistance. Start with this. Demand that Hamas give up the hostages it's been holding for 10 months, including American hostages. These people were abducted. They're being tortured. They can't even see the Red Cross. Let them go. And then say the Israelis will stop firing. Or better yet, I would say Hamas gives up the hostages and says, we're not firing any more weapons. We want a ceasefire. We want an armistice. Then the war ends. Could end tomorrow. Better yet, Hamas says, we tried. We inflicted damage on Israel, but we have to recognize reality. We're releasing the hostages. We're not killing any more hostages, and we're going to surrender. And by the way, we ask in return for surrender that our leaders get to leave the country and go somewhere else and not be killed. The Israelis have no intention of killing them. The Israelis would accept a deal like that. So this war could end tomorrow. And additional support, by the way, the people of Gaza are getting more support in the midst of a war than the Germans got during World War II, and than any people in the entirety of the war, during any war in the entire world that you can imagine. They're getting more support, and it's coming from Israel as Israel fights them. All it's necessary is for Hamas to say, we're stopping. Gaza was not a terrible place when the ceasefire was in effect, which it was until October 6th of last year. Look at the pictures. We didn't have much good reporting coming out of Gaza. There were poor people in Gaza for sure. But they had the UN providing health care, providing education, and you had villas on the sea. Read the op-ed in the New York Times that the mayor of Gaza wrote about what his city was like before October 7th. It was not a terrible place at all. It was a place with seaside boardwalks and restaurants and theaters and cultural centers. Hamas brought this to Gaza. Hamas brought this to the Palestinian people. Hamas is responsible. I'm not giving an inch on this.
And that's it for this week's episode of The World Deciphered. I'm your host, Iya Meurmishvili. Be sure to join us again next week for more of the deep insights and expert analysis that you've come to expect from the Cipher Brief. And of course, visit us at decipherbrief.com, where you can subscribe to our open source report, keeping you up to speed on what's happening in the world every Monday through Friday. Also, subscribe to our YouTube channel and watch our extended interviews and get insights from our experts. See you next week, and remember, national security is everyone's business.